Here it goes. All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And before I introduce my guest, I just want to say I just want to give my heart's empathy, compassion, companionship, and all my love and best to Rania Khalek, Manar Adli, Rania Masri, Julia Hassam, Dr. Mara Osman, and Leif Maruth, all of whom have been on the show at least once, except the good doctor. She's been on twice, and I've been a guest on her show, Mini Stream. All these people are either based in Lebanon or have innumerable family, friends, colleagues, comrades, close communities. And while three of the people I mentioned aren't based in Lebanon, I'm praying that their homes have been unharmed and that those dearest to them are all right, or as best as one can do, considering the state terrorism of Western-backed Israel. Marwa and her family are displaced at the moment, and I don't know how others are doing directly or indirectly, so our deepest prayer is that all is well with them, and if not, that all will be well with them and their loved ones in both Lebanon, Syria, the occupied territories of historic Palestine, Ms. Adley. So power to the people and death to Western imperialism, settler colonialism, and Zionism. And now, we welcome back to the show Alison Bodine. Alison is an American-Canadian journalist, social justice, and anti-imperialist activist based in British Columbia. She's part of the editorial board of Fire This Time, which is a superb independent leftist newspaper, and of course, and then when not publishing, while not. Okay, I got that screwed up. And yes, and while she does when she does do informative, when she is working on this informative newspaper, which follows Canadian imperialism and social, racial, and eco-justice issues, Alison also does weekly and often monthly in-person protests against Canadian U.S. meddling in Venezuela, demanding an end to the embargo on Cuba, as well as other anti-war and anti-imperialist actions against NATO, and of course, recently the ongoing state terrorism and genocide of Israel and Gaza, the occupied territories in Lebanon, and of course doing candlelight vigils for Aaron Bushnell. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of her incredible work that she and her team do. So first off, Alison, welcome back on the show on our All Things Latin America and Canada edition.
Thank you very much, Youri. It's a pleasure to be here once again and have what I hope will be, and I know will be, a good conversation about what's happening in Venezuela today, which is, I will say just off the beginning, as we're talking, of course, about our continued resistance and in solidarity with the Palestinian resistance against Israeli genocide and this U.S.-Israeli war machine. Venezuela is very much on the right side of history, standing with the Palestinian people as well and Lebanese people, and part of the axis of resistance. So it's really my pleasure to talk about Venezuela today and why solidarity with this anti-imperialist country is also critical to our work of building a better world.
I couldn't agree with you more. And as somebody who's based in Europe, I live in Belgium, which is the belly of the other beast, NATO and the EU, what I call, pan-European imperialism. And I can tell you, to watch like the heads of states of like Colombia, Brazil, Venezuela, and so forth, and how they're speaking out against Israel, you compare and contrast that to members of the European Union, NATO. It's embarrassing. And actually, but before we talk about Venezuela, Alison, I have to ask you this question, which is, now you've you're part Canadian and Canada is your home, and I know that the other day was Truth and Reconciliation Day, Orange Shirt Day in Canada, to reflect on race relations between white multiracial Canada and its Indigenous people, and of course remembering the lives broken and traumatized and lost to the residential schools. Now, you're originally from Colorado, the U.S., and I'm wondering, what's it going to take for the U.S. to get to the level Canada and New Zealand is at, which is recognizing hugely the wrongs of the past and making an effort at improving race relations, or as I often say, what's it going to take for U.S. people power movements, whether it's Black Leftists, Latinx Leftists, anti-imperialist Palestine justice groups, queer liberationists, feminists, environmental groups, eco-socialists, and eco-justice groups, and the workers' rights movement and others, to show more urgent solidarity to the plight of Native Americans, and I'm not even mentioning Australia because they're actually worse. They're actually the worst of the four in the Five Eyes Alliance when it comes to apartheid and mistreatment of its indigenous people. But I'm curious your response about about the U.S.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I would also want to say about Canada that yes, it's true. There is now a day recognized as Truth and Reconciliation Day. Various activities take part across the country. Here in British Columbia, it's I didn't go to work on that day, but we did have our weekly protest at the U.S. consulate, organized by a group called Mobilization Against War and Occupation, which is against U.S. Israel's genocide on Palestine. And at this day, we had speakers that addressed the connections which are continuing between the government of Canada's support for Israel and their continued oppression of Indigenous people. So although this day exists, it's very much lip service. It's it's a quite performative day. There's government officials making all sort of statements about how they're moving forward progress towards support towards Indigenous people in Canada, but the statistics really say otherwise. There was a report released just a few days before Truth and Reconciliation Day that showed that over the time of the pandemic, Indigenous men in British Columbia's life expectancy dropped by 7 years. It is already lower than the life expectancy of averaged across British Columbia, but it dropped, I believe, to 61 years, which is Canada is one of the richest countries in the world, completely unacceptable, and I think a telltale sign of continued genocide against Indigenous people. So we have this Truth and Reconciliation Day, but when it comes to actual changes in the everyday lives of Indigenous peoples, whether they live on reserves or they are in cities, they continue to have their resources stolen, their language and cultural practices are suppressed, and they also face this reality of health outcomes, education outcomes, and we have a lot of work to do here in Canada in order to really also within ourselves and within progressive movements to really understand and apply what it means to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people in Canada and to say self-determination for Indigenous nations, including Canada, as part of our demands. So I think that same necessity needs to happen in the United States. It's a very different country in some ways, just because of its size. You being in Europe, the dynamics between countries of different sizes can be quite different. And Canada, most of the population of Canada lives very close to the US. So I think that there's something to be said about really the necessity of movements on both sides of the borders to really reflect more the struggle of Indigenous peoples and to make sure it's part of our work for social justice. So let's continue to do that work, and let's continue to recognize Indigenous resistance here as well.
Yeah, well, I often say that I wish that the U.S. had Canada's level of solidarity when it comes to Indigenous people, and that Canada had the U.S.'s anti-imperialist movement, but anywho. And actually, just before we talk about Venezuela, I have to ask this question. Which is, I know many people are burnt out by the ongoing genocide and gross collective punishment Israel is doing in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, as well as Lebanon and Syria. And I know it's very easy to fall into extreme despair, even if one is taking action and protesting against Israel and its backers in pick whatever Western capitalist state that backs Israel. But I want you to inspire our respective audience and show them that it's not all doom and gloom, because you were instrumental in freeing Meng Wanzhou with the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, the CFPI, and other groups. You were vital, and that's another statement, but you were vital in helping free Alex Saab, a Venezuelan diplomat who was wrongly imprisoned and arbitrarily detained by the American authorities. And with the release several weeks or months ago, I can't remember, of Julian Assange, the founder and former editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, who was wrongly imprisoned in Belmarsh, arbitrarily detained and systematically tortured for several years in Britain. Can you talk to us about how, despite however small our groups are, however small our audiences might be, and however much we feel sometimes ignored or are ignored, we don't need to have like a huge, vast audience like the right-wing and insincere liberal publications have, like, or those in major corporate states. But like, because as Ralph Nader said, breaking through power is easier than you think, and sometimes it often takes just a small but determined group of people with a conscience and left-wing values to change the world for the better. And I think us freeing, Madame Monzou, Alex Saab, and Julian Assange is a perfect example of that. So I wanted your response on that before we get to Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, we do have victories in the people's movement for liberation. It's important to recall those, remember them, think about the organizing that was behind that you're referring to, our work to try and make these important human rights issues, rights of democratic rights issues, especially when it comes to political prisoners, make them, coffee table issues by building more united and stronger international movements, particularly in the case of Julian Assange, Alex Saab, and also Meng Wanzhou. And I would add to that the Cuban 5 political prisoners who were released in 2014, but that is a very important, continues to be an important example of building a movement around political prisoners and gaining a victory. So I think that focusing and talking about those victories is important at a time like this, and also recognizing and often reminding ourselves that the prisoners themselves in all of those cases, and also the, I would say especially around Palestine and Lebanon right now, the people themselves living through this genocide have not given up their resistance, their defense of their basic rights, and their demands for liberation. And so we have to stand in solidarity with them as people that live in countries like the US, Canada, Europe, the belly of the beast, as we say, and really feel that responsibility and understand, when we see that young girl in Gaza who's standing in line for food, and giving what she has to her neighbors, or that person that's had their entire house demolished but is out there cleaning their courtyard of the rubble to establish their continued resistance. That those stories also have to remind us of our responsibility to keep organizing in the streets, and recognizing that we can convince working, poor, and oppressed people of the need to support Palestine, to support Lebanon, to support political prisoners, and bring people over to the right side of history. And I think that that day-to-day work is extremely important now, more than ever.
And actually, that's a perfect segue to this question. So now on to Venezuela. Now you have been a lifelong, Venezuela solidarity person. You've used your journalism to push back against the tsunami of propaganda people get on Venezuela and recycle. And of course, in recent news, you were an election observer and helper in the recent general elections in Venezuela. Please explain, based on your experience, why there is no way Maduro could have cheated, how the Western-backed far-right capitalist opposition lost fair and square, and my follow-up question would be what is currently going on now, and the importance, and also the importance that we really need a strong anti-imperialist movement to demonstrate against further economic terrorism and other actions like a possible color revolution against Venezuela.
Yeah, thank you. So I had the honor, yes, of being an international elections observer during the July 28th presidential election in Venezuela. So we've now passed 2 months since President Nicolas Maduro was reelected with a 52% of the vote against the right-wing opposition candidate whose name is Edmundo Gonzalez, who received about 43% of the vote. This was an election held in calmness and tranquility, despite what media would say leading up to it, was an election that was also similar to previous presidential elections, the last one being in 2018. We had Western media, imperialist media saying the election, if Maduro wins, there will be fraud. You could go through the pages of most major media, New York Times, CBC, all of this, and the statements of the US State Department, and they would have said, if Maduro wins, it's fraud. So this was a pre-planned outcome and a pre-planned response. So it was kind of no surprise when those election results came out. But then the next day, the opposition said, no, we won, there was fraud, and then presented all of this so-called evidence to the world, and was given the same platform on imperialist Western media to say that they were the victors. So I just wanted to emphasize, like, as an elections observer, what we experienced on the ground was pretty different, because it was the ability to talk to people about the election, to experience the day of the election, and to know that people really were having what in some ways is kind of a celebration in Venezuela. Elections in Venezuela, it's not only the presidential elections or governors or parliament, there's elections on different issues, referendums. People are well practiced in their democratic process, and a process that they call protagonistic democracy, something where it's putting the elections and their democratic voting, bringing it to the base and trying to really create much more of a fervor around elections that's based on political conviction, rather than what could be described more as a media frenzy, for example, when it comes to the US elections, where it's, people are spending millions of dollars during the elections. In Venezuela, instead, it's a process of education about the candidates, about the platforms. It's a process of how do you vote? What do you do? I mean, just to go through the process, and why you said, as you mentioned, it's, fraud proof, I wanted to share this, which I got when we were in Venezuela. And this is, it's printed on newsprint. It was distributed in mass across the country, and is only one example of different educational materials. But basically, it's describing how you go to vote, what it's going to look like, and it does look very similar to this everywhere. Reminding people of the process, and then presenting them, this is what the ballot looked like in Venezuela, and it is what they look like. The face of the candidate, and then the political party that they're representing is shown here, and it's describing to them, this is, what will happen. This is what will be your vote. And the process in Venezuela has a few differences that aren't talked about, of course, during these Western media articles. And one of those is that when people go up to this electronic voting machine, they select their choice, and it actually prints a receipt, so they can confirm that the electronically submitted one that was recorded on that machine is the same as what gets printed out on a paper. They take the paper and they put it in a box themselves that's sealed, so that at some point, when it goes through its processes of audits, which is constitutionally covered in Venezuela, they will count the votes in those different ways and audit the results, the electronic ones versus the paper ones, and really come to a conclusion and a result that means that the numbers announced are very bulletproof. It's a tight election, leaving very little and no space for fraud, has even been recognized in the past by institutions in the United States, such as Jimmy Carter's institution. Ex-US President Jimmy Carter recognized Venezuela's election as being one of the best in the world, their whole electoral process. And, this year, they didn't come to that same conclusion, but investigative journalists have traced that very clearly back to the fact that some of their new executive director, I believe, is quite tied to the CIA in the United States. So, we can take that Jimmy Carter's statement for what it is. They recognize the election process. It hasn't changed since then. But more importantly, we can see what's happening on the ground. So the day after the election in Venezuela, well, let's say, actually, as an elections observer, I can say the hours after, we observed throughout the day, went to voting centers, talked to people. People expressed they were voting, freely, fairly. They knew the process. They were able to check their registration. Nothing strange was happening around them. And that's what we confirmed that with our own eyes as well. And then we went after the election was over and were able to observe some of the preliminary audits that happened. So Venezuela's constitution and their National Electoral Council, the CNE that runs the elections, sets up various audits, and one of those involves every individual voting table, which can have witnesses from every political party at it, goes through a process of counting the votes after the election, and that's done in a way that witnesses can observe. And I walked by 2 or 3 separate occasions when people were observing this process. Some were like outside the fence and they were just neighbors and they were watching, and some were the official observers. But all of that was being done in basically a calm atmosphere. Though there were some instances in other parts of the country where the right-wing opposition was trying to prevent people that were still in line from voting, because Venezuela also, within their laws, says that the polls will stay open as long as people are in the line. So opposition was documented in a few voting centers to try and prevent people from continuing to vote. But outside of that, the night of the election, we went to Miraflores Palace. I went to Miraflores Palace. It was an open rally. Anyone could come to it to await the election's results. The election results came in just after midnight, the ones I said earlier, where Maduro had won 52% of the vote. They announced Maduro the leader. The National Electoral Council did. And there was still relative calm throughout the country. I was in Caracas, but there were also no reports at that moment of anything violent happening. And I ended up staying out a bit late that evening and was able to observe the city. And but that had changed by the next morning when Maria Corina Machado, who's a name that's probably familiar to a lot of your listeners, opposition, far right-wing opposition, violent opposition leader, she basically gave the symbol to start an attempted coup against Venezuela and against the re-election of President Nicolas Maduro, by announcing that Edmundo Gonzalez, the candidate of the opposition, had in fact won the election. And this activated various cells across the country that started attacks on public institutions, that tore down a statue of Chavez, that tore down a statue of an indigenous resistance leader, that attacked, things like community radios, schools, hospitals, very targeted at the institutions of the Bolivarian Revolution. And those continued for about 36 hours and kind of skirmishes for another week or so, resulting, unfortunately, in deaths in Venezuela. And that is, a result of the opposition, and resulting in the deaths of some also Chavista leaders. And this is a result, again, of this violent right-wing opposition. But Chavismo also immediately began to mobilize, and we saw mass rallies in Venezuela against the acts of violence, especially by the opposition right wing, and in support of the re-election of Maduro. And so, although we could analyze what this or that institution outside of Venezuela says about the votes, there's lots of articles and information about it, but I would just emphasize that actually, recognizing the sovereignty and self-determination of Venezuela means that it's up to the Venezuelan people to determine whether there was fraud or not. And a very clear indicator of what the Venezuelan people feel about that is that those in favor of President Nicolas Maduro and recognizing the results that he had won the election mobilized millions in the streets in the week after the election. The opposition, funded some violent acts to take place, and then had rallies of a few thousand people. and all of that's, very well documented. So I would say that the Venezuelan people have definitively said there was not fraud. We recognize the re-election of our president and our determination to continue our defending Venezuela's independence and sovereignty. And we've seen that over these last 2 months with continued mass mobilizations and really Venezuelan society moving forward as the opposition continues to scramble, which we could talk about more. But I just wanted to emphasize what we've seen and what I observed before leaving. We international observers, due to the violent skirmishes that had happened, we left the country quite quickly. We got out safely, and the mood when I left, I believe on the 30th of September, 2 days after the July, was one where there was still a lot of tension in the air, but also that we had already seen the mass mobilizations of Venezuelans in favor of the election and of President Nicolas Maduro. And so we knew it was going in a direction that the attempted coup had been defeated, but there was still tension at that time.
Yeah, I have a friend. I cannot reveal who the person was because they didn't give me permission, but they were part of a Canadian delegation, and the person told me when I was in touch, said that there was no way that any kind of fraud could have taken place, and that everything was more or less quite peaceful. It was only when, as you mentioned, when Machado started to say that no, we won, and Maduro cheated, and then of course the right wing opposition started to mobilize, and the person said that that the Venezuelan authorities, soldiers, and so forth had to take them to a very safe place, first by bus, and then to a safe place because they were very much afraid of their lives, and they had to wait numerous hours until it was safe for them to get safe journeys out of Venezuela. And I know that Dimitri Lascaris, Dr. Mara Osman, Arnold August, who's been on the program. I mean, they all were election observers, and okay, yes, they do have a bias towards Maduro, but they all said that we came as independent election observers, and there was just simply no way that that fraud could have taken place. And you mentioned about the violence that the opposition is doing. Western, back to opposition. So I have to ask this question, which is, how frightened are you and your comrades that this new chapter of the war on Venezuela could get deadlier, and the Western-backed far-right opposition and whomever are allied with them will escalate their means to unseating Maduro and the ruling Socialist Party and trying to overturn all of the social gains of both Chavez and Maduro?
Yeah, I think over the last 2 months, we have seen such a powerful response from Chavismo, and I was fortunate enough to return to Venezuela about 25 days later to observe a communal election, and see a very different atmosphere had already been established. But the U.S. will clearly go forward in their regime change operations. I think that we've seen, and I don't want to discount, we're talking about far right, yes, U.S.-backed and funded opposition violence, or the violence of mobs essentially that are paid. That's taking place within U.S. sanctions, which I do want to recognize as also, a form of violence, a form of war against Venezuela. It's
exactly.
really continues to strangle the economy, continues to make access to medicines especially difficult. And the U.S. has intensified those attacks, including as recently as just a month ago on September 12th, when the U.S. announced more sanctions against Venezuela in the form of sanctions against individuals associated with the National Electoral Council, which they called Maduro allies, instead of recognizing, there's independent institutions in Venezuela and people affiliated with those institutions. But as far as the U.S. attempts at destabilization after the elections, I would say have failed. They did when I was there about 1 month ago, for the second time, Maduro announced some cabinet shifts, and one of those involved the appointment of Diosdado Cabello, who is the vice president of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, to interior minister. And the interior ministry, he's a very powerful individual in Venezuela, very sharp and decisive in the Bolivarian revolutionary process, and someone who was also appointed as interior ministry following the coup attempt against Hugo Chavez that failed in
interesting.
2002. So his appointment definitely signifies a strong hand against further destabilization attempts. And for example, just about a month ago as well, 3 Americans, 2 Spaniards, and 1 Czech citizen were arrested in Venezuela after being accused of coming to Venezuela on an assassination attempt against President Nicolas Maduro, which we've had other examples of in recent history. The Bay of Piglets Operation Gideon, as it was named, which also failed. And we know the U.S. will try in all sorts of different ways, but I think the Bolivarian people of Venezuela have shown how, once again, how difficult it will be. And as the U.S. continues to have their efforts at war and occupation and hegemony thwarted in other arenas and other parts of the world, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to introduce more instability into Venezuela at this time. And but I won't be surprised at, of course, any further attempts. I think we're dealing with a Bolivarian revolution that is more equipped to respond based also on experiences of especially 2017, 2018, when they experienced a round of something called the guarimbas, which is a word used in Venezuela to describe really escalated violence on the streets and riots that are supported and funded by the U.S. and the opposition, that results in the deaths of people, of Chavistas mostly in Venezuela, but they've learned their lessons from that time as well. And Venezuela is a very organized society, part of the Bolivarian revolutionary process. One that I observed during the communal elections was, the organization of Venezuela into community councils, into communes, all sorts of levels of organization that help them respond to U.S. funded destabilization attempts. And I think the U.S. needs to, learn their lessons in Venezuela. I think they're also going to have a difficult time kind of planning their next steps, because the supposed winner of Venezuela's elections, according to Marina Corina Machado and imperialist governments, though I will say they haven't officially recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as the winner. They just have skirted that and said there was fraud and we don't recognize that this was a fair election. But Edmundo Gonzalez fled to Spain on September 8th. So the person that supposedly is going to become president of Venezuela in January is now in Spain, where he's received political asylum. And he doesn't seem to have the heart or determination from his public statements to really go back to Venezuela right now or take his seat as so-called president. So I think the U.S. is going to find themselves in a bit of a debacle around that as well. And I just all credit to the Bolivarian revolutionary people of Venezuela who've asserted their independence and sovereignty. And it's really been an honor to go there and observe that in person and to talk to people about this, especially over the last month.
Yeah, shame on the Spanish government. The Spanish government at the moment is ruled by a kind of a very fragile coalition of the center left and Podemos, and it's just it's disgusting how their response to, in general, their response to Latin American affairs and international affairs, their response has been atrocious. But then I have to ask this question before I ask you to show some slides you wanted to share, which is, okay, I understand why Spain has that response from the major parties, but can you respond to why Lula of Brazil and Petro of Colombia, who's actually been quite overall has been quite good in reestablishing ties with Venezuela and having good relations with Venezuela. Why both of them seem to play footsie with this nonsense that Maduro committed fraud and that he should have re-elections, that they should redo everything from the start, and which I find is a concession to Western imperialism. I'm curious your response on that.
Yeah, I think that there are other countries, especially those in the Caribbean, that have stood immediately with Venezuela's right to determine the results of their own election, Venezuela's sovereignty, and have invoked correctly the doctrine of non-interference in the affairs of other countries, which I do believe that Petro and Lula have both violated with their comments. And yeah. I think this is a result of a few things. I mean, we know that the United States is putting pressure on these countries, that they don't want, Brazil does not want, Colombia does not want to see the same sort of destabilization leveled against them. And so they're making their own calculations about that, although it is it's angering to see. But there is also the case that I question whether in these countries as well, they really want to see a mobilized grassroots movement like in Venezuela. Venezuela is an example of a country that is beginning to take power into its own hands, where people are exercising their democracy on the streets and building popular power. And I think it remains, I would question whether the Lula or Petro are wanting to see that happen in their own countries. And I think there is some trepidation about Venezuela's example reaching more deeply into Colombia and into Brazil. So I think that's part of it, and that we have to definitely, stand with those countries, which it's still the majority of countries. The U.S. is once again saying the world doesn't recognize Maduro, the world sees fraud. All of this language we see constantly being and rhetoric being thrown by the United States. But really, when we look at a map, when we look at how many countries are in Latin America, the U.S. is actually very unsuccessful at building any sort of coalition against Venezuela at this time. We're not seeing a repeat quite yet of the Lima group, which Canada was part of after the last election and around Guaido. So there is, some changing politics in the region that I think the U.S. will have less of a foothold, but we still have to be very cautious, and we have to increase our solidarity, which is, why I appreciate this interview and all of your work, Youri, because that's really what we have to work towards, is building, more united, a broader solidarity movement and a united front around the world in defense of Venezuela's sovereignty and self-determination. And that happens partly on the ground when we are able to be, as international elections observers, exchanging and talking to one another. There was over 930 of us at the presidential election. We've continued our organizing and correspondence to hopefully coordinate actions and informational sessions and kind of sharing the truth about what's happening in Venezuela on the ground. And then after the communal elections, we're now as part of another delegation of about 100 people internationally as well, continuing that work. So yeah, if we have time, I'd love to show a few photos.
Exactly. I actually was just about to ask you that before I get to my last two questions. So go right ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to share with people a little bit about what it looks like on the ground in Venezuela. No, it's not an easy country to travel to in a lot of ways, especially due to U.S. Sanctions. And so I wanted to share what it was like on elections day. This is Caracas. You can see in the middle the table, talking that it's.
Wait, it still hasn't been shared yet.
Oh, it still hasn't been shared. Thank you. I have to press this button.
Okay, now it's good. Okay, now it's good.
Perfect. Now you can see a table with in downtown Caracas. Also, Venezuela is very full of murals and people expressing their political thoughts on the sides of walls. This is a a beautiful wall. You can see all the flags and a table set up in support of President Nicolas Maduro talking about the election.
Nice.
We also attended many events to learn about Venezuela's electoral process. This is just one of them, where we were learning about some of the rules around the Constitution and the different levels of audits in the election, and kind of what we would expect when visiting the electoral centers. We also talked and heard talks from various Venezuelan officials about the US threats and sanctions and continuing attacks against Venezuela and Venezuela's response. There was a lot of talk specifically about Venezuela's economic recovery. Venezuela's believe has the highest growth rate of any economy in Latin America due to the determination of the Venezuelan people in a large part. And it was very interesting to learn about that.
Wow.
Then on the election day, we observed what we thought we would, which included a robust system in Venezuela of ability to help people who have various challenges getting to electoral centers to exercise their right to vote. And here we can see someone assisting a voter. This is the process of checking an identity card. It's important to understand that before the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998, he took office in 1999, most Venezuelans were denied the ability to access an identification card and were therefore disenfranchised. They could not vote because they experienced a high rate of illiteracy, or they didn't have this identification card and they were denied their rights to vote. But now every Venezuelan has access to an election, to be able to register an election who is 18 years old or over, and this identification card. And one of the first initiatives of the Bolivarian revolutionary process was, of course, to work closely with Cuba in implementing a mass literacy program. And now Venezuela has a very, very low rate of illiteracy in the country.
Wow.
This is the common voting center. This is actually in a richer part, a more, one would say, pro-opposition, perhaps, part of Venezuela. You can see lines starting to form, and most centers we visited throughout the day kind of had a steady line going. We visited one that had a particularly long line as well, but you could see that there was going to be a high voter turnout, which there was in the end. A voter turnout that I believe was one of the highest recently, about 60%.
Wow.
This is what a voting center looks like. And the checking again on the walls is something we see. This is what I referred to when I talked about the audits taking place. So these are, Venezuelan citizens just watching the audit, and then inside the fence is kind of the more official people. But you can see how accessible and transparent the electoral process is.
And that's also where they would announce who won city council here, who won in the parliaments here, and stuff like that.
Yeah, they eventually, those results are made public. So, and then this is the press conference on the day after, kind of watching Maduro talk about the election and how things had went. This is kind of right when the right-wing violence had started. We actually were all gathered for a press conference and had quite many delays getting out of where we were because they were trying to figure out the safest way to get everyone where we needed to go. And in a national observer vest. So that is that election. And then just to 2 more minutes, share a few photos from when returned to Venezuela for the communal election. Venezuela has 4,500 communal councils throughout the country. It's kind of an first level of democracy. We could probably talk for a few hours about how it's organized, but essentially communal councils are run out of neighborhoods. Not every neighborhood has them. It's places that want them. They organize them. They then unite different communal councils into a commune. Communes are who voted on the day that I visited, or the week I visited Venezuela at the end of August, about 1 month after the election. And like I said, returned to an atmosphere where people were going back to the everyday work of building the Bolivarian revolutionary process and organizing in their communities. And had really defeated the coup, and the atmosphere was very different than the one, yes, you described the day that we left Venezuela. There was a lot of tension in the air, and it was very different when I touched down in Venezuela a month later. I also traveled to Anzoátegui, which is a state in Venezuela, which is located on the eastern part of the country on the coast. And so that was an incredible experience to visit outside of Venezuela. This is us landing at the airport in this state in order to observe an election within the communes where people were voting on what projects to be prioritized in their community. And the winner of each project throughout the country of these 4,500 communes was going to get $10,000 from the government in order to implement their project throughout the next 3 months. This is just some examples. This truck is interesting because it's not only saying Comuna La Sirena de Guanta, so the name of the commune, but also the truck itself was purchased after a similar vote took place 3 months ago, and the community prioritized buying a truck that could be available for use of all members, about 3,000 families of the commune. It's a truck to help transport things around, and they decided they needed that. You can see the truck there in the back, and this is some leaders within La Guanta area that we were in telling us about their project. Another project that 3 months ago had been voted was the renovation of this center, which is a Barrio Adentro center, which means that it is a center for Cuban doctors in Venezuela, where Venezuelans receive healthcare as part of their free healthcare system in their community, and 2 Cuban doctors work out of this office, and it was renovated as part of the initiative of the commune in the 3-month period before the election observed. This is us arriving at another commune. So we went to multiple voting centers, and they were all voting for their own projects. And this is the kind of greetings you get. They knew we were international observers. They came, they told us about the process in their community councils and communes, what projects they were working towards in their community, and raised a fist in resistance. These are the kind of lines outside of the voting center in this case. So again, we can see it was a popular election, all sorts of people, all ages of people wanting to participate. This is the Jefe del Centro Electoral, so the head of the electoral center in this neighborhood. And on the left, there were lists all over, but this is explaining that you'd be voting on these 7 projects, which one to prioritize, things like renovations to a health center. And I believe there's some projects related to education.
Fantastic.
The kind of lines again, people waiting, and then the inside of the vote. So you can see the voting looking very similar for each election. As I said, Venezuelans are very used to this process. They believe in it. And then also, I just wanted to share 2 photos of, some international observers that were there. It's really fortunate that at the communal elections was joined by Gerardo Hernandez, who's one of the Cuban 5 political prisoners, who's now
okay,
and
interesting.
Gerardo Hernandez in Cuba is the head of the Committees of Defense of the Revolution, which are in some ways Cuba's first level of democracy. Their neighborhood organization is the CDR, the Committee in Defense of the Revolution. So Gerardo being there was really special to talk to him. And, because we're here observing some of Venezuela's first level democracy as well. And then this is a fellow observer whose name is actually Youri, and he's from Spain.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and this is, we were from all over the place, and he does Venezuela solidarity in Spain. And so we were making connections and talking about future solidarity work together. So I just wanted to give people a taste of what it was like, to really encourage people to, of course, read the truth about Venezuela, but also if you ever get the chance to go, then take that opportunity.
Now, Alison, I have 2 more questions left, and I actually I'm going to invite you back on to come back on at a hopefully at a very near date, because I have so many questions that's like going through my mind about like the Venezuelan process and how you would compare that to yours truly, Canada, the U.S., and even Britain. But we're gonna have to save that for another time. But speaking of Cuba, that's actually a great segue to my second to last question. Now, I don't know if we have enough time, but the last time we spoke, when you talked to me in the audience about your background, your political awakenings, and joining people power movements and anti-imperialist movement, you said it was Cuba that led you to Venezuela, and I find that fascinating because often, unless you're a communist or something like that, it's often people they get in the Americas when they get involved in anti-imperialist and solidarity activities. It's usually another country which leads them to Cuba, not Cuba that leads them to you know Venezuela or Nicaragua or Peru or Colombia and so forth. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your time in Cuba and how that kind of led you to Venezuela solidarity.
Yeah, well, I think Cuba was just so much part of my awakening into how the world worked and imperialism, the criminal U.S. blockade, that I was fortunate to not so much stumble upon Cuba initially, but to find Cuba through work against war and occupation, through moving here to Vancouver, Canada, and connecting with Fire This Time movement for social justice. I hadn't thought much about Cuba before then. It wasn't really discussed in school in Colorado. It wasn't a political issue. I actually think Cuba's talked about more generally now than it was when I first went in 2006-ish.
Yeah.
And, I think that we have, I went to Cuba, began work against the US blockade in solidarity with the Cuban Five, and through that began to learn more about the close ties that Cuba, Fidel Castro, and others had with Comandante Chavez, someone that I'd heard talked about before, and it was just kind of at a pretty similar time period finding out about the various tentacles of the United States imperialism and their attempts to overthrow governments of sovereign countries, that I found out about Cuba and was able to visit there, and then also had found out about Venezuela through my organizing here. I mean, we just recognized, I think it was 20 years. You'd have to check the date. I believe it was 20 years that Hugo Chavez stood in the United Nations and said,
Yeah.
it smells like sulfur. I think it was the 20th anniversary just a few days ago, right? And so
it is that 20th anniversary.
yeah, as someone coming from the US as an anti-war activist, when I moved to Canada, I had been protesting against the war in Iraq while living in the United States in high school and had come here. And so seeing that, you're looking for what countries are standing in solidarity with people are right. That they are being oppressed by US imperialism. So I would do the same thing at this moment. If there's any activists listening that are standing in solidarity with Palestine and Lebanon, look around the world at the other countries like Cuba and Venezuela that are also standing with Palestine and Lebanon, and then look into those countries and how we can build more international solidarity. It's important at this time as much as it was during the war in Iraq 20 years ago.
Couldn't agree with you more. And my final question is this: how do you deal, or how do you deal, and what should be our response if we were hypothetically to meet a Cuban American or a Cuban Canadian or some kind of Cuban exile who claims their parents and the people they know were victims of political persecutions, and they depict the Cuban Revolution as the book Animal Farm. and assuming so, and let's assume that they don't have any far right skeletons in their closet and have legitimate grievances against the government past or present. How do you approach these people, and how should we approach anyone who doesn't believe in Western backed regime change operations, and certainly not in the blockade but détente with Cuba?
Yeah, I think that there's, of course, various levels of political understanding for all sorts of folks that may have immigrated or left Cuba or Venezuela. a majority of whom leave for economic reasons caused by the U.S. blockade and sanctions on both of those countries, and shade kind of their political rhetoric around those countries, oftentimes because in Canada or the United States, especially, of course, they're given special privileges if they claim, as immigrants, they're given special privileges if they claim they're political refugees, they're fleeing, communism, these sort of things. They're given access to all sorts of things that the other refugees are not. If you haven't looked
Wow,
into,
I actually did not know that. So it's kind of like the incentive of a Korean defector. So even if like a North Korean defector might have some legitimate grievances against the North Korean government, but oftentimes when they want to flee to South Korea or to the United States, basically it's been found that most of what they say about North Korea are a pack of lies or a half truth, at best. So I had no idea that it's also the same like with with like Cuban exiles, that they have an incentive to say I'm being persecuted politically and whatnot.
Yeah, well, there's a really insidious and a deadly policy of the United States government called the wet foot, dry foot policy that has been in since the 1990s. And what it is if Cubans flee Cuba, so take a boat in some sort of dangerous manner, get to the United States, they are given a refugee status. They're accepted into the United States. If they attempt to come to the U.S. through proper immigration channels, proper, I'll say, the open the borders, rights for all immigrants, but through the official channels of the United States, like going to the U.S. consulate or embassy in Havana, applying, all of these things, the U.S. actively denies visas, doesn't let people immigrate that way, does not fulfill their commitments to the Cuban government to accept a certain number of immigrants from Cuba, because they'd rather have people flee in these deadly ways because it looks a lot better for them politically. And so I would look up the wet foot, dry foot policy if you haven't in a while. And similarly, we can see the differences in the ways the media, it really has attempted to use Venezuelan immigrants as opposed to how they treat immigrants from Guatemala, Honduras, U.S. allied countries. So I think that, and other U.S. allied, and yeah, anyways, in U.S. allied countries. And so I think that we have to really be careful, and we also should be able to reach out to a lot of folks immigrating from Cuba or Venezuela, and hopefully convince them to join the movement against the blockade and against U.S. sanctions, and understand for some it may be easier once you're outside of the country and your day-to-day life is not so impacted by the blockade and sanctions, to see through the U.S. propaganda, which also tells Cubans all the time, it's not us, it's the Cuban government that's denying you these things. It's not our fault. The U.S. has a lot of access to Cuba in some ways, through media, through WhatsApp, there's Cuba is an island, but it's not isolated from the world of capitalism and imperialism. And so I think sometimes, I've worked with Cuban Americans who, when they lived in Cuba, didn't have that same perspective, and thought it was the Cuban government. But then they moved to the U.S. and they saw the lies of the U.S. in many myriad of other ways. They had their American dream unfortunately shattered, and were able to fully understand the murderous genocidal policy of blockade against Cuba as well. And so I hope we can approach people that way. I mean, some will never be able to convince, but we're looking for those that we can, and so we can attempt to build the broader, more united movement that we need against the U.S. blockade on Cuba and against the sanctions on Venezuela.
And actually, then I have to. I promise this is my last question. So if I've never met a Cuban exile in in Belgium or Spain or wherever in the United States, someone who hasn't someone who who emigrated completely legally, and they don't have anything against their government, but they are looking for a better life, and so they've opened up a Cuban restaurant, or they opened up a Cuban bar, or they want to practice medicine elsewhere, or want to be a lawyer elsewhere. Is the reason why we've not been exposed to those kind of Cubans because of like America's asinine blockade, in which like they really like try to sabotage like even Cubans that do appreciate the government but just want to, you know, move elsewhere. So like America actually will sabotage them actually even coming into the country unless they come in illegally, and that's of course that's a way to try to like, you know, depict they're fleeing, you know, political persecution in Cuba and so forth, when really a lot of times they are just fleeing because of just they just cannot deal with some of the horrendous effects of yeah, sanctions, economic terrorism, whatever one wants to call them.
Yeah, I would say yes. Yes, that is a policy of imperialist governments to promote irregular and deadly immigration in order to fit their narrative of people fleeing the countries that they blockade. You know, there are definitely some Cubans, Venezuela, you know, there's immigrants that have immigrated through other channels, like the ways that have been set up through embassies, that also choose not to speak out against the policies of the US government, that have bought into the American dream, that have achieved some success despite the challenges. So, you know, it's not going to be everybody. But really, I would say that also I think that our solidarity, you know, there's so many people we can reach. We've talked about some victories that we've had in the solidarity movement. We talked about, you know, ongoing need to build solidarity and actions and coordinate. And there's just so many more people that I think we can reach to bring to the side of justice and against US blockades and sanctions and against the imperialism. But it takes organizing and work on the streets. And but there's the majority of people I really believe will be on our side if we can reach them.
All right, fantastic. Well, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One, our All Things Latin America edition with Alison Bodine, who, let me remind the audience, is an American Canadian journalist and social justice anti-imperialist activist based in British Columbia. She's part of the editorial board of Fire This Time, a superb independent leftist newspaper. And Alison and her team also does weekly and a monthly in-person protest against Canadian U.S. meddling in Venezuela, also demanding an end to the embargo on Cuba, as well as other anti-war, anti-imperialist actions, recently mobilizing against the ongoing state terrorism and genocide of Israel and Gaza, the occupied territories of Lebanon, and candlelight vigils for our martyr Aaron Bushnell. She's also
Youri, could I jump in quickly? I just have two things I want to announce, if that's all right. One is my book. I know
I was just about to actually mention that.
Okay, excellent. So,
go right ahead.
Revolution in Venezuela, available on battleofideaspress.com. Encourage people, if you'd like, to order a book. Thank you, Youri, for your review last time when you read it. It was great to hear from you.
And also, folks living in Canada internationally, y'all can get a subscription to Fire This Time and have it mailed to you. It'll be money well spent. Check out their work. Subscribe to them subscribe to them also at their website, which I will link. That way, that way, Fire This Time will email you and let you know when the team is doing an online web event, and if you live in BC and elsewhere in Canada, when they're doing in-person protests and more. Alison, all my best. Thank you for coming on, and you know, all my best. And I hope to have you back in the future, real soon. And it was a real honor to talk to you again.
Thank you to you as well, Youri. And I'll just ask if you could add one more link to the post. The Venezuela Solidarity Network is a new network of people living in Canada and the US working to defend Venezuela's sovereignty and self-determination. It's VenezuelaSolidarityNetwork.org. So in addition to firethistimethe.net, if you could link VenezuelaSolidarityNetwork.org, it'd be much appreciated. Invite anyone to join into this growing movement to build more coordinated, united, broader action in solidarity with Venezuela.
It'll be an honor and well due.